James Walker sat in his apartment, the dim light of the street lamps outside casting long shadows across the room. His desk was cluttered with unopened letters, half empty mugs of coffee, a laptop with the screen flickering. He was staring at it blankly, feeling a sense of helplessness that had become all too familiar. The cursor blinked in defiance, mocking him for his inability to find the right words. A notification pinged on his phone. His best friend, Mark, had posted a picture of himself standing in front of a grand new house, a mansion really, with the caption, "Hard work pays off, dreams do come true." The message stung, reminding James of everything he felt he had yet to accomplish. James wasn't jealous of Mark, not exactly, but seeing him succeed made the contrast between their lives feel even more glaring. Mark had everything: success, confidence, wealth, and James felt like he was stuck in a cycle of frustration and disappointment. He thought about his own life: a mid-level job he hated, a stagnant career, and the deep-seated feeling that no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't get it right. Mark's success felt like a reflection of his own failure. James could never seem to measure up, and his mind spiraled deeper into the abyss of comparison. He spent the next few hours on his couch, wondering if he was ever going to break free of the comparison trap. The frustration gnawed at him. Why can't I have what he has? What's wrong with me? The next day, James walked into work with the same cloud of self-doubt hanging over him. He worked at a marketing firm, not exactly living his dream, but it paid the bills. He had been there for 5 years, and it seemed like all of his colleagues were climbing the corporate ladder while he remained stuck. Lunchtime came, and James was scrolling through emails when one from his boss, Corinne, caught his eye. "James, we would like to offer you a new role in the company, one that involves more responsibility. Let me know if you're interested." For a moment, his heart raced. This could be the break he had been waiting for. But as quickly as the excitement appeared, the doubts flooded his mind. What if I'm not cut out for this? What if I fail? Mark had been the first to notice the shift in his demeanor when they met for lunch later that day. "What's up, man?" Mark asked, noticing the look on James's face. James hesitated before telling him about the new opportunity. "I just feel like I'm not ready for it. What if I screw it up?" Mark smiled knowingly. "James, you've been working here longer than anyone. You've earned this. Stop doubting yourself." But despite Mark's encouragement, James couldn't shake the fear of failure. The idea of stepping up terrified him. He had always been someone who shied away from risk, from anything that could potentially confirm his insecurities. Maybe I should just stay where I am. It's safe. That night, James tried to push the thought aside, but the nagging feeling lingered. Later that week, James made a rare visit to his father's house. Peter Walker, his father, had always been the driving force in James's life. His father had built a successful business from the ground up, and there was always an expectation for James to follow in his footsteps. As James entered the house, his father led him to the backyard, where two trees stood side by side. One was a towering oak tree, strong and sturdy, its branches sprawling into the sky. The other was a delicate cherry blossom, its pale pink petals just beginning to bloom in the spring. Which tree do you think is better? Peter asked. James thought for a moment before answering. The oak is stronger, but the cherry blossom is more beautiful when it blooms. Peter nodded. Exactly. They're both valuable in their own ways. The oak doesn't try to be a cherry blossom, and the cherry blossom doesn't try to be an oak. They grow at their own pace. They don't compare themselves to each other. They just are. James was quiet for a long moment, allowing his father's words to sink in. Maybe he didn't need to be like Mark or anyone else. Maybe he could grow at his own pace, find his own rhythm, and stop comparing himself to others. Inspired by his father's words, James took a different approach to life. He began to focus on the things that made him feel alive, things that had been neglected over the years. He rediscovered his passion for writing, something he had once loved as a child but had pushed aside. As he focused on work and the pressures of life, he dusted off an old notebook filled with stories he had written as a teenager. Slowly, over the course of weeks, he began writing again, pouring his thoughts and emotions onto the page. He wasn't writing for anyone else. He was writing for himself. However, as his creativity began to flow, doubt still lingered. Who am I to think I can write something meaningful? What if no one cares? But rather than giving into the fear, he kept going. James decided to share one of his stories online, not expecting much, but to his surprise, the story began to gain traction. People commented, shared, and even sent messages thanking him for his raw honesty. This spoke to me. I feel like you wrote this for me. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of accomplishment and validation. This wasn't from anyone else, it came from within. The creative expression that had once been stifled was now a form of freedom. Though his writing success was a welcome victory, James still wrestled with his inner critic. The moment he felt a glimmer of hope, doubt would always find a way to creep back in. Social media posts, the success of his peers, and the constant barrage of other people's accomplishments threatened to drag him back into the comparison game. One day, he received an email that made his heart race. A publishing company was interested in his writing. It was the break he had been waiting for, but the same self-doubt crept in. What if I'm not good enough? He couldn't stop the voices in his head, but he remembered his father's words, "Grow at your own pace." So he replied to the publisher, setting up a meeting. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being authentic. It was about embracing his own story and his own journey. The meeting with the publisher went well. James signed a contract for his first book, a collection of short stories. It was a significant step forward in his career, but it didn't erase the fear completely. The same nagging doubts lingered. What if his isn't enough? What if no one reads it? But James learned to silence the voice of comparison. He started writing with intention, pouring his heart into each word, trusting that his uniqueness was enough. With Maria's love and the support of his friends and family, James began to heal the wounds of his past. The constant comparisons to his brother, Ethan, had always made him feel like a failure. Ethan had been the golden child, successful, admired, and always the first choice. But James came to understand that his value didn't come from meeting other people's expectations. It came from within. His father acknowledged his past mistakes, offering an apology for pushing him to be someone he wasn't. And with that, James was free from the weight of comparison, free to write his own story, and free to step into the life he was meant to live. In the months that followed, James continued to grow both personally and professionally. His book was well received, and he began to speak at conferences, sharing his story with others. But the most significant transformation had been internal. He had stopped comparing himself to others. He had stopped seeking validation from the outside world. And most importantly, he had come to understand that his worth was not defined by anyone else's success or achievements. It was defined by his own authenticity. James stood in front of a room full of aspiring writers, sharing his journey. "You are enough," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "Your uniqueness is your greatest gift. Don't try to be anyone else. Embrace who you are, and everything else will fall into place." And in that moment, he truly believed it. This marks a turning point in James's life. He had learned to embrace his uniqueness, to stop comparing himself to others, and to trust that his journey was his own to define. He had found peace within himself and was ready to share his story with the world. As James's professional life flourished, he found himself constantly looking for new ways to grow and explore different opportunities. The idea of sticking to the traditional path had always been something that weighed heavily on him. After all, he had been told that there was one clear route to success: climb the corporate ladder, get promoted, and find fulfillment in the job that was expected of him. But now, with his newfound sense of confidence and self-awareness, James had the courage to explore a more unconventional route. He wanted to combine his writing with a more meaningful life, one where he could travel, connect with people, and continue to write stories that were authentic and raw. It wasn't easy. He had to take a leap of faith, leave behind the security of his full-time job, and embrace a world where he would be his own boss. There were risks involved: financial instability, uncertainty about the future, and the fear of failure. But for the first time, James wasn't afraid. Instead, he felt excited. The world, in all its unpredictability, became a vast canvas. He could create whatever he wanted. James decided to travel. He spent the next few months visiting different countries, meeting key people, and immersing himself in different cultures. During his travels, he kept a journal, writing about the people he met, the experiences he had, and the emotions that came with stepping out of his comfort zone. In Paris, he sat in cafes, observing the people around him, their conversations blending with the clink of coffee cups and the hum of traffic. In Tokyo, he walked through the neon-lit streets at night, marveling at the contrast between tradition and modernity. And in Cairo, he wandered through the dusty streets, awed by the weight of history and the beauty of the ancient pyramids. Each experience became a source of inspiration for his writing. He began to write stories that were deeply influenced by the places he visited and the people he encountered. These stories were not just about the external world, but about his inner journey, how he was changing, how he was learning to embrace vulnerability, and how he was becoming more comfortable with who he was. One evening, while sitting in a cafe in Prague, he had an epiphany. The reason he had been so unhappy for all those years wasn't because of his lack of success, it was because he had been constantly trying to live up to other people's expectations, chasing dreams that weren't his own. He realized then that he had spent too much of his life trying to fit in, when what he really needed to do was embrace the things that made him different, the things that made him unique. In the months that followed, James's work began to evolve. He started a blog where he shared not only his travel experiences, but also his personal struggles, his moments of doubt, and his journey to self-acceptance. His writing had become more intimate, more vulnerable, and as he shared his truth, he found that others were responding. They resonated with his stories of overcoming self-doubt and embracing the uncomfortable truths about themselves. His blog grew in popularity, and soon James was invited to speak at events, not as a motivational speaker, but as someone who had lived through the ups and downs of life and had the courage to share his story with the world. One evening, after a particularly moving speech at a local conference, a woman approached him. She was in her mid-30s, dressed simply in a black dress, with an air of quiet strength. "James," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I don't know how to thank you. Your words, your story made me realize I've been living someone else's life. I've been stuck in a job I hate, trying to meet expectations that aren't mine. But you made me see that I have the power to change my life, that I don't have to be afraid of being myself. Thank you." James smiled, a deep sense of fulfillment washing over him. In that moment, he realized that all the struggles, all the doubts had been worth it. He wasn't just writing for himself anymore, he was writing for others, sharing the wisdom he had gained in the hopes that it could help someone else find their own path. As his career continued to thrive, James began to slow down and appreciate the simpler moments of life. He spent more time with his family, reconnecting with his mother and father, mending old wounds, and finding peace in their presence. His relationship with Maria blossomed further, and they moved into a small apartment together, a quiet space where they could both grow and nurture their individual journeys. James's life was no longer defined by comparison or the need to be someone he wasn't. He had embraced his uniqueness, accepted his flaws, and, most importantly, learned to love himself for who he was. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their apartment, watching the sun set over the city skyline, Maria looked at James and smiled. "I love you just as you are," she said softly. "You're perfect in your imperfection." James gazed at her, feeling a wave of gratitude and peace wash over him. He had spent so many years seeking validation from others, comparing himself to everyone around him. But now, with Maria by his side, he understood that true fulfillment came from within. James's transformation became a ripple effect that touched everyone around him. His friends, family, and colleagues began to see the changes in him, his confidence, his openness, and his sense of peace were contagious. They, too, began to question their own assumptions about success and self-worth. His book, which he had once doubted would find an audience, became a bestseller. But for James, it wasn't the financial success or recognition that mattered. It was the fact that his words had touched people, had made them reflect on their own lives, and had inspired them to embrace their own uniqueness. He continued to speak at events, sharing his story, but now his message had evolved. It was no longer about just overcoming self-doubt. It was about creating a life that was true to who you were, a life that was built on self-love, acceptance, and authenticity. One day, as James was signing a book for a young reader who had come to one of his speaking engagements, the reader looked up at him with wide eyes. "You really believe this, don't you?" James paused for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I do. And I want you to believe it too." Years passed, and James's life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. He had become a best-selling author, an influential speaker, and a mentor to others who were just beginning their journey of self-discovery. But what brought him the most joy was knowing that he had finally found peace within himself. He no longer compared himself to anyone else. He no longer felt the weight of expectations or the pressure to conform. He had become the man he had always been meant to be. One day, James sat down to write his next book, but this time he wasn't writing for fame or validation. He was writing because it was a part of him, something that gave him purpose and allowed him to share his story with the world. And he knew deep in his heart that the journey of self-acceptance was never truly over. James's story wasn't just a story of success. It was a story of transformation. It was the story of a man who had struggled with comparison, doubt, and fear, but who had eventually learned to embrace his uniqueness, accept his imperfections, and live authentically.